This is the Biblical Unitarian Podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Biblical Unitarian Podcast, the podcast that aims to start conversations about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. My name is Dustin Smith, and as always, I will be your host. This week we have episode 364 entitled, Does Proverbs 30 verse 4 prove Jesus' preexistence? Now, I've made the argument in my videos that the standard position among Old Testament scholars, namely that Jesus Christ was not conscious and alive during the period of the Old Testament documents, is in fact the scholarly consensus. Instead, we see consistent evidence and data pointing to the fact that God created all alone. He created by himself. And the Messiah is a promised figure, an anticipated figure, someone who was expected to descend from the lines of Abraham, from Judah, and from King David. Nevertheless, I am reliably informed, air quotes, by those who comment on my videos in an attempt to set me straight and out of the path leading to heresy that the Old Testament does actually speak about the Son of God alive and well. And the verse that gets pointed to me is Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4, a passage that, by the way, is never quoted in the New Testament to refer to Jesus. So this week's episode will look closely at Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4, in order to determine whether it refers to the pre-existent Son of God, Jesus Christ, in the pages of the Old Testament. So we'll look at Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 in its context, and we will ascertain what it meant to the original readers. Then what I'm going to do is I'm going to steelman the argument, suggesting that the verse does, in fact, refer to Jesus as the Son of God in the Old Testament, in order to demonstrate why this particular reading, when steelmanned, is extremely unlikely. So, what is Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 all about? And does it prove the literal preexistence of the Son of God in the Old Testament? Let's find out on this week's episode of the Biblical Unitarian Podcast. Our first point today is a close look of Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 and its context. So, of course, we can't read verse 4 until we read verses 1, 2, and 3. So let's begin. Starting in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 1. The words of Agur, son of Jakeh, the oracle, the man declares, I am weary, O God, I am weary, O God, and worn out. Surely, I am too stupid to be a man. I have not the understanding of a man. I have not learned wisdom, nor have I the knowledge of the Holy One. Who has ascended to heaven and come down? Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Who has wrapped up the waters in a garment? Who has established all the ends of the earth? What is his name, and what is his son's name? Surely you know. That's Proverbs chapter 30, verses 1 through 4. And as you can see there in verse 4, the question is raised as to what is his name and what is his son's name. And the argument that is commonly put forth is that his name must be God or Yahweh, and his son's name must be Jesus. There you have it. The Old Testament writer of Proverbs chapter 30 is pointing to the Son of God alive and well, and he has a name that surely the reader is supposed to know. Now, I'm not actually convinced that that is the best reading of this passage, and here are the reasons why. So this begins with an oracle from a guy named Agur, A-G-U-R. It just rolls off the tongue, and surely many women are going to be naming their next child Agur, and he is the son of Jakeh. And what we notice in verses 2 and 3 is that Agur openly acknowledges his own ignorance. And he doesn't just do it a couple of times, he does it 4 times. First thing that he says, at least in this translation, is that I am just too stupid to be a man. And what's interesting here is that this verb, to be stupid, is the verb ba'ar, which is actually related in Hebrew to the intelligence of animals, like compared to cattle. As such, Agur is actually comparing himself to having the understanding of animals when it compares to even human understanding. The second thing he notes is that he does not have the understanding of man. The third thing is that he says that he has not learned wisdom, which seemingly is the primary purpose of the book of Proverbs. And the fourth thing he acknowledges is that Agur does not possess the knowledge of the Holy One. And I'm going to take the phrase Holy One to refer to the God of Israel. So Agur is basically saying he's fairly ignorant in about the strongest possible terms that he can make. And then, in his self-professed ignorance, Agur raises 4 questions in verse 4. And these are the questions that he raises. Who has gone up to heaven and come down? Question 1. Who has gathered the wind in his fist? Question number 2. Who has wrapped the water in a garment? Question number 3. And who has established all the ends of the earth? Question number 4. So when you read this passage in its context, we can see that Agur's line of questions, given the context of his own acknowledgement of his human ignorance, really should be confining these 4 questions to human beings. So the questions that Agur is asking really is in line with what man has gone up to heaven and come down. Namely, what human being has gone up to grasp this understanding of God, to receive God's wisdom, and has come down to share it with us. And the implied answer to that is, at the time of the writing of Proverbs, no human being has done that. The second question is, what human being can gather the wind into his or her own power, that is, into their hands? And of course, the question is, no one. No one is capable of doing that. The third question, what human beings can gather water into a garment, that is, gather it into clothing? Well, obviously, nobody has that ability. And of course, the last question, what man can say that they've created all the ends of the earth? Not one single human being. And then the fifth and final question concerns who possibly could do these godlike things. Who could traverse the universe? Who controls the elements, the wind and the waters? And who created the world? And this would result in an obvious answer to the question. What is his name and his son's name? And the answer is nobody, of course. That's the response that the author is trying to give. He acknowledges his own ignorance, his own lack of understanding about basic human things and about the Holy One. And then he says, who can do these godlike things? Who actually possesses the knowledge and the capabilities of doing these things? And he's like, show me. What is his name? What is his son's name? And the answer obviously implies nobody. Human beings are aware that they are less powerful and less capable than the Creator God. Therefore, the application of all this is that human beings should, in fact, rely upon God. And guess what? this is exactly how the passage continues in verses 5 through 6. Let's read those. Proverbs chapter 30, verse 5 says that every word of God proves true. He is a shield to those who take refuge in him. Do not add to his words, lest he rebuke you and you be found a liar. That's Proverbs 30, verses 5 through 6. So, in light of acknowledging that humanity by themselves do not possess the knowledge of the Holy One, they don't have the knowledge that is necessary, only God has that knowledge and only God possesses these capabilities, then human beings should rely upon this God. God's oracles, the Word of God, these oracles are true and they're truthful. Agur also tells us that God is a help to those who place their trust in him. He is a shield. But those who alter his words, his truthful and true, helpful words, those persons are subject to rebuke and to receiving the label of being a liar. Now, since no human being can actually perform the things of God on their own merit, by their own power, through mustering their own strength, the logical response is that these human beings should rely upon God for direction, moral formation, and based on the wider teachings of Proverbs, for receiving their wise teachings. And for what it's worth, the only other reference to his son in Proverbs, when we look at Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4, what is his name and what is his son's name? The only other reference to that is in Proverbs chapter 13, verse 24, where it refers to, guess what, a human father and his human son. So I think that Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 is a rhetorical question requiring a negative answer. Nobody, as in no mortal, has actually performed these things, and that it's not referring to Yahweh, and it's certainly not referring to Yahweh's son. But I thought that it would be best to actually steelman that argument and to see if it actually can pass the test, and that's what we're going to do with our second point. Point number 2, could Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 refer to Yahweh and Jesus? So as I mentioned, some have suggested that his name and his son's name in Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 must refer to Yahweh and to Jesus. Now, here are the reasons why I am confident that this interpretation is extremely unlikely. This is highly unlikely as to what the original author was trying to convey to his original audience. The first point, which I think really needs to be considered by people who think that this is referring to Jesus, is to look at the order of the first question that was raised. It talked about ascending into heaven and descending. And it's the order of this. It's ascending and then descending. And the way that you would perceive this in your mind is that somebody is on the ground first, and they go up to heaven, presumably to gain wisdom, knowledge, and understanding the divine secrets from God, and then they would descend afterwards to hold all of those wise teachings or to share them with others. But notice, they ascend first, and then they descend. And to say that this is in reference to God, that God has ascended and then he descended, it actually doesn't fit very well. You would think that God is someone who's in heaven. You would think that he would descend and then he would ascend. So take, for example, Genesis chapter 11, to where God came down to view what was taking place at the Tower of Babel. He descended first, and then presumably he went back to heaven and he ascended. But the question here is raised from the perspective of someone who ascends first, and then he descends. It's not the sort of thing that you would say about God. It makes much more sense that this is referring to a human being who is on the ground, he's on the earth, and of course the implied answer is What sort of human being has actually done this? And that answer, of course, is nobody. Obviously, nobody has ascended and then descended. Now, if you're thinking of John chapter 3, verse 13, that is a good place to be thinking. Because in John 3:13, in the New Testament, long after the book of Proverbs has been finalized and after Jesus has been born, Jesus says, let's just kind of get some context here. He's talking to Nicodemus. And in chapter 3, verse 12, Jesus says, "If I have told you earthly things and you do not believe, how can you believe if I tell you heavenly things? No one has ascended into heaven except he who descended from heaven, the Son of Man." That's John 3, verses 12 through 13. And so what Jesus is saying here is that no human being has ascended in order to learn these heavenly things and then descend, except for the Son of Man. Notice, except for a human being, a member of the human race. Now, this is true of Jesus. And he says this in his capacity as the human Son of Man. He is the one who has descended with the wise teachings of God, and he actually is the one who's actually going to share them with his disciples. He's the one who has reached into the mind of God, and he has descended in order to give those to him. I've got several videos that will talk about this, several podcast episodes that are going to talk about this, and of course, I deal with it extensively in my latest book, Wisdom, Christology, and the Gospel of John. But the point is, Jesus can actually say this about himself. And he's saying that you can't say this about anyone else except for me, the Son of Man. But it is true during the life of Jesus, but it wasn't true back in Proverbs. Why? Because at the time of the book of Proverbs, Jesus wasn't alive yet. He wasn't born yet. And Jesus is saying this is only true in his capacity as a human being. Even those that think that Jesus consciously preexisted his birth and that he was alive and well in the Old Testament, either as a second member of the Trinity or as Michael the Archangel or as some sort of spirit angelic being, they wouldn't describe him as a human being. They wouldn't say that. So you can't read Proverbs 30, verse 4 in light of John 3:13. Another reason why Proverbs 30, verse 4 doesn't refer to Yahweh and, of course, to Yahweh's Son is that Agur has explicitly admitted to us that he does not have knowledge of the Holy One. He says that in chapter 30, verse 3. So if Agur is admitting that he does not have the knowledge of God, then it is fairly unlikely that Agur is going to go on and tell us all about God in the very next verse. And not only about God, but also God's Son. So to suggest that Agur both does not possess the knowledge of the Holy One in verse 3, and that he does also tell us all about the Holy One in chapter 30, verse 4, is a huge stretch that I think strains the text. It is far easier to understand Agur noting the ignorance of human wisdom, along with humanity's inability to perform God-like things. Another reason to discount the suggestion that Proverbs 30, verse 4 is in reference to God and Jesus is that Jesus wasn't in existence yet. Jesus came into existence at the moment of his Genesis. And Matthew chapter 1, verse 18 uses the noun Genesis to refer to the time in which Jesus was brought into existence in the womb of his mother. That's when Jesus was created. And Jesus was begotten, according to Matthew 1:20 and Luke 1:35. And we've also indicated that Jesus Christ, the promised Messiah, is the descendant of Abraham, Judah, and David. And this is quite explicit in the genealogies that spell this out in Matthew chapter 1 and in Luke chapter 3. Jesus wasn't in existence at the time of the Old Testament. Even if you want to attribute some sort of preexistence to Jesus, it can't be literal preexistence. It has to be notional preexistence, or preexisting as God's personified wisdom or God's personified word. And then, if we wanted to look at the earliest Jewish interpretation of Proverbs 30, verse 4, we can look no further than how the Jews translated it into the Septuagint, the LXX. And the Septuagint read the question in chapter 30, verse 4, as asking about his name and the name of his sons, in the plural, the name of his children, in Greek, tis, teknis, optu. What is his name and what is the name of his children? So this would mean that the earliest documented Jewish view of Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 was not about the preexistent Son of God, but a hypothetical question about somebody and his children, which again better fits the suggestion that the questions were raised in regard to humanity. What human being could do this? What son of humanity could do this? Which of his children could potentially do this? And not in reference to God and the supposedly pre-existent Son of God. So, in short, Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 is raising a bunch of hypothetical questions about things that a normal human being cannot potentially do, raising the question, who can do these godlike things? Tell me his name. Tell me the name of his son, leading to the obvious answer that nobody could do these. No human being could actually do these things. Therefore, Proverbs chapter 30, verse 4 is not, in fact, a reference to the pre-existent Son of God. It's not a reference to Jesus Christ at all. Thank you so much for listening to this week's episode. Please join us next week as we explore Revelation chapter 3, verse 14, a passage that's often pointed to in order to suggest that Jesus was the first created being in God's creation. So please look forward to our next episode. Now, if you enjoy our podcast, please consider supporting us as we aim to promote the sound truths about the oneness and unity of God and about the humanity of Jesus. You can support us absolutely for free by subscribing on YouTube or iTunes or even on TikTok. You can give us an honest review online, and of course, by sharing your favorite episodes with your friends. That helps the channel for free. Now, if you want to throw us a few dollars, you can check out our episode subscription for a link to PayPal, or you can subscribe with one of two membership options on the YouTube channel. The Biblical Unitarian Podcast is produced and edited by Dustin Williams. I am Dustin Smith, your host. Until next time, please take care.